everyone, and welcome to Fashioning Resurgence, a panel series in partnership with the School of Fashion at Ryerson University and with Indigenous Fashion Week Toronto. I'm Sage Paul. I'm the Artistic Director at Indigenous Fashion Week Toronto, and we're here today with Lisa Myers and Megan O'Brien to speak about A Thread That Never Breaks, an exhibition that has now gone digital. Lisa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Lisa Myers. I'm a curator and an artist, and I teach at in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. And I'm working with Sage on this exhibition. I'm also, my mom's family's from Chimnasing or Beausoleil First Nation, and my dad's English and Austrian, grew up in Southern Ontario. So that's me.
Thank you. Megan?
Yeah, my name is Megan O'Brien. My name in the Haida language is Jad Kajus, and I use that a lot artistically. I've got matrilineal lineage with the Haida, and then I was born in the village of Alert Bay, and Kwakwaka'wakw ancestry as well. And my dad, he was born in Ireland and immigrated as a kid, and also was in Ontario, and then came across the country. But I'm a weaver, and yeah, I've mostly been working with basketry and ceremonial textiles, some explorations in fashion. And then in the last couple of years, more recently, working with a group on a digital lab, I guess, on translating some works into another realm.
Awesome. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Megan. So Megan's an artist in the exhibition A Thread That Never Breaks. And like Lisa said, we're co-curators on this project together. A Thread That Never Breaks is an exhibition that features Angel Obi-Shawn, Carolyn Monet, Joy Arcan, Olivia Wheaton, Leanna Marshall, and Pacific Sisters, and Megan. And I was hoping, Lisa, would you be able to share a little bit more just about the curatorial vision of the exhibition before we jump into Megan's talk?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it was something that you shared with me, and it really related to the curatorial project that I had, when we spoke, I had recently just finished working on. And the two things both happened at the Textile Museum. So it related to a talk that you conveyed to me that you attended, that Megan, when Megan was speaking about her work and the way that threads connect to ancestral knowledge, and coming out of just finishing working on the show Beads, They're Sewn So Tight, I had been really thinking about the way that bead work also, kind of contains the knowledge of previous generations. Designs are informed by previous, just like a lot of people's experience in their lives. And so these sort of ideas came together in our conversations, and I think that started sort of building the premise for the exhibition, A Thread That Never Breaks. And it brought my interest in beadwork and in sort of textile work into what I see as your sort of expertise and your focus in around Indigenous fashion. And so I think that the lineup of artists that we're working with really bring those worlds, show that intersection of those worlds. And I don't really see them as completely separate at all, but these artists bring those together. So that, and so the premise is around how threads connect these works in fiber and in textiles, connect to ancestral knowledge and connect to the knowledge and our life experience that people bring to their work. So it has a kind of connection to the past, or ancestral knowledge that is present. So I think that is also what I wanted to emphasize, is that it's about a presence as well of that. So that's what I think of. That's how I would explain the curatorial premise. Oh,
I love it so much, and it's just, yeah, like you said, I was totally inspired by your talk, Megan, that you gave of a very similar name to our exhibition. And I just feel so grateful and excited that you like allowed us to kind of take this idea that is so, I think, intrinsic in so many, the way that so many artists work, like that we are all carrying on like our ancestral knowledge and the practices that have been passed on. And I'm so grateful that Lisa, you and I get to work together, because I am totally fashion. I'm such a fashion girl. Of course, I really love to look at work critically and curatorially, I guess. Like, so I think all of us coming together is really, it's like a gift for me. And Megan, could you share a little bit more about that talk that you gave at the Textile Museum?
Yeah. Yeah, so that was a talk. It was the second time I'd given it. The first time was at the Textile Society of America's symposium. And the theme of that symposium was deep local to pan global, and looking at some of the ways that those two ideas interact, and how sometimes, mostly with Indigenous practices all over the world, how some of them are being exported globally. And so I was invited for that one and put together my very first PowerPoint presentation and was really nervous. But yeah, when we had it at the Textile Society, or at the Textile Museum of Canada, I gave the same talk. It was the same length of time. And yeah, I before I was doing it, I was really nervous, and I kind of had a little bit of writing that I put down for at the beginning, because most of it's just kind of saying whatever in a way that needs to be said in the presence, like especially when you're in a room, there's such like a synthesis of like all of the people that are there, like it creates something different. So anyway, what I had wrote a bit about that was the threads that do not break are the ones we cannot see. They're those that we carry within us. They are the ones that are passed silently from generation to generation and often go unnoticed. These are the threads that, even though at times they may be dormant, are always present. It's only us who can connect with and see them, and if we feel is necessary, find ways to keep pulling them forward with us. I believe that our ability to connect with these ancestral threads requires a shift in our thinking, a shift in our way of seeing ourselves and the world around us in a new way. And I invite those, that are listening and participating in the space that's created by us being here, to work with that, and like with those threads, like acknowledging that we carry those in our own hands, and as being alive in the present, that we're creating for the future as well. And that it's this thing that's passed to our descendants so that they can continue the story. And I just think there's this amazing power in the present moment and in our ability to weave a new story for those who come after us. And yeah, it's stuff I feel pretty strongly about, I guess, from an ideas perspective. And I think since I wrote that, there's a lot more, as we're talking about it in this context, the ways that ideas transform and are added to and evolve and I'm talking mostly about weaving, like a traditional practice in that. But what I've really been interested in the last maybe like 4 or 5 years, I've been thinking a lot about, as someone who is working with something that came from another society than the one we're in now, like the old societies of our people on the Northwest Coast. I see that art form as being a product of that society and that way of seeing, and the relationships that our people carried, not only with each other in our communities, but with the natural world. And yeah, we're in a very different society. Like we've got a lot of different concepts going around, and how do I take what I view as my practice as a weaver and the way I was trained as a form of education? What are the teachings that come from that, and how can those be translated into a way that makes it so that it's not something relegated to the past, but it has relevance for today? And yeah, and a lot of the times, the object gets too sticky or way too easy to classify in today's world, like classify and dismiss, like label, like I understand that, and then move on. It needs something more to like kind of break through, I think. So that's like what you're talking about, Lisa, you know, bringing together these different worlds, I guess, that they are the same thing, but they're categorized in different ways. And this is kind of like a really amazing opportunity to break down those classifications.
Oh, you're on mute.
Even time-wise or temporally, like thinking about categorizing things as past, as being in the past, like categorization and is, I think, can apply to that too. And that these, and what I love about this the concept and that what you just talked about, threads, and I love the threads as a plural kind of, because there's multiple kinds of connections that are made. I think that I love that it is in the present that these things are manifesting in there, and that they are that it breaks up that kind of idea that that it's only, you know, sort of accessed as a historical thing, or yeah, and that so often happens within museum collections and things like that. So I think that's a really interesting part of your weaving practice, and just sort of not to dwell on the work that I did with beadwork by, you know, Bev Kosky and Olivia Waitung and Katie Longboat and Jean Marshall for that show at the Textile Museum. But I do think that is something, like, there is a presence that they create of the not only techniques, but the kinds of patterns and the knowledge and the kind of way that they approach their use of threads, you know. So I think that's really, I love that. I love what you're thinking around that as a weaver, you know, artist. Yeah.
Yeah, that idea of time and space. I feel like you know, we think about ancestors as being in the past, and that's sort of like when we categorize everything, and everything gets siloed, even between mediums, even between our generations. That was in the past, now I'm going to do something new. But we need that ancestral knowledge to move into the future. And like, I think it also is really grounding in who we are today, and knowing that we will be future ancestors. You know, these are kinds of these ideas that we leave for, you know, our nieces, our nephews, our grandchildren, and our great great grandchildren. And what are we leaving for them, and how are we leaving that information for them? And with the exhibition going online, I find that is so, it's wild that this has had to happen in this way, because we are always working with tangible materials. You know, we all those are, and we have the physical action of weaving something or beading something or sewing something, and now we're going online, which is this whole different medium. And it's really, like, I find it really trippy, because when I'm watching these, you know, these avatars in Abtech, so we're moving to Abtech, right? And Abtech Island and Second Life, which is this like weird cyberspace world where they call those shapes primitive, and they are then building woven garments or woven textiles out of these primitive shapes. They're literally called, you use a primitive shape to build these different items in Second Life. And so just to see how new that, like, it is in that world, but it's still a place where we can carry on these ancient techniques, you know, these ancestral skills and techniques and stories that have been passed on to us. So it's like, what is our role now in that world of the digital world, and carrying on these practices that are completely changed online?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I don't know, maybe we should talk about what Second Life is actually. I feel like I just jumped in, but
yeah, well, you know, I mean, you know, it's been really interesting meeting the artists there and having a space for artists to create their work and to be take that from the physical realm to the digital realm.
Yeah, but where transmediating has come up, like, it's so interesting, where we've worked with well, we've had a couple of meetings to bring the artists into the space and really talk about it. But that sandbox within that space where the artist can actually create, I think it really starts to make it real. You know, it's no longer just a digital image on the screen. Like you really see the building blocks of creating work within Second Life. And I just find it interesting that they call it transmediating. Did they make that word up? Or is it like, is that an actual like term for digitizing work? And like what is transmediating to you, to both of you?
Do you want to go first, Megan?
Yeah, I guess it's
feel
the
like I've
first
been talking.
time that I've heard the word, but I think it's just like translating different objects between mediums or like something along the lines of that. Yeah. So yeah, I think there's like huge potential with it, but also I guess in the digital realm, you know, that separation of us from the physical world and being able to interact with it and travel and all these things. I mean, on one level, it like opens things up into a whole new way of doing things, but also takes certain things away. And we're always like building on our own understandings of things, I guess. But and yeah, the experience of taking like one of my woven pieces and bringing it into the digital realm, I found for me was a huge educational process, because I guess that's what that work was. It's called Wrapped in the Cloud, and is on display now at a few different places. But yeah, I just found myself, I found it in a way it was a really like healing my relationship with technology, or giving me a bigger understanding of it. And part of the conversations that were had by the group I was working with called Making Culture Lab. And then there was a digital artist named Conrad Sly, who actually created the work. But when we were working together, it was this feeling when we were doing it, like we used a laser scanner to take the piece in. And then we did photogrammetry. So it takes images of the piece all the way around. And then Conrad takes all of that into his like computer, and then his computer can't even handle it. So it's like connected to all these crazy servers all over the world in these programs that like thousands of people have been building over like years and years and years. And it's just kind of mind boggling. So yeah, but there were some like similarities and really interesting things that arose out of that process for me. And I've always viewed technology as something really alienating. But through that, I kind of saw it like the human element in it in a way I hadn't before, which was really refreshing. And so much of my practice is very solitary and creating with just, you know, on one dimension, it's just me, you know, like with some materials, but on another, I guess there's like deeper layers to that. But yeah, it was just super interesting. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is like, why does a work exist? And like, I feel about the Wrapped in the Cloud piece, and yeah, that the why of that for me was a really powerful one, because I wanted the work to come home. And this idea that technology, like 3D printing and creating a digital replica of a physical work, had this tremendous possibility it opened up to have the piece exist in multiple places. And Sage, like what you were saying about, we're always working with physical, tangible things. And there's like a fragility, I guess, to like the physical world as well. When, you know, we have an object, or we make an object, and then there's one of those and it's a piece of art and it exists as a singularity, I guess. But as soon as that work went into a digital realm, it was like, it existed in this weird other space and had the ability to be sent without like shipping. And it just felt like it had like this immortality to it. Like it had been captured at such a high level and recreated in the digital space that it was always going to exist there, I guess. And then the hard drive crashed and I realized it's not, it's not exactly immortal, but it was really interesting because, you know, it was interesting because also weaving so often is talked about as being like one dimensional, or like just like very like flat and on a wall and not a sculpture. But when you take that into, and it's a joke anyway, like when people talk about it that way. But But yeah, 3D printing or like scanning it in, it's like, no, this thing has like so much depth and dimension as you break it down into its parts. And as the maker, you understand that, but like the whole idea of categorizing. Anyway, that was, I guess, part of my experience with transmediating, but yeah.
Wow. I think that's just so amazing. Oh, you're on silent, Lisa.
I don't know. Oh, that's because I got kicked off. I think that what transmediating, in what I hear, you know, with what you're saying, Megan, too, I think of it as a kind of translation as well between different media, transferring something from, you know, a physical to this digital is one kind of transmediation. But it makes me think about the transmediation when I think about translation. When I think about translation, you know, I think about how that is something that Indigenous artists have been doing for a really long time. And even just thinking about, you know, kind of when I think about translation, I think about language, and I think about, you know, trying to relearn Anishinaabe-Moyen and trying to think about how do I translate things? Like, I think I sort of face that on a maybe really often. So this idea of translation, I think, is something that I feel like I've contended with as an artist or as a curator, in meaning, through, you know, conveying meaning, but also conveying, working between, you know, converting or I don't know, translation between media. So I can see that so strongly in your work, Megan. And I think that this exhibition is kind of, you know, I think maybe it was already there. Transmediating was already there in a way, before we, you know, before we even had to deal with the digital realm. But it was in different kinds of, like, maybe in ways that we hadn't really thought through. But I guess trying to, like, bringing knowledge into different medias is a kind of form of that transmediation. I think it's a really useful, like, term to think through in what we're doing, like curatorial and art practice. And I'm pretty sure that I mean, it would be interesting to talk to Scawanati more about that term in terms of the way that and how she's working in Second Life. So those are the things that come through for me when I think about transmediation. I think about translation, and I think about, and then I think about, you know, working in different medias and bringing your knowledge and your practice into different medias, into different media. Anyway, and I don't know, like, Sage, what do you think this means for Indigenous made fashion, as a person who is very much steeped in fashion, and especially in terms of Indigenous fashion specifically? And, you know, I think I know that, yeah, I guess I am curious to know do you think that's in transmediation, this kind of translation or moving between media? How do you see that coming, or maybe manifesting in the fashion that you're seeing coming out from me?
Well, it's so interesting to think about it as translation, because things get lost in translation all the time. And like, reproducing items can be amazing and can really support communities and bring us together, but it can also pose a lot of issues. You know, people can then just take it and use it, and they see things out of context because we're no longer with the person who's created it, or you're no longer in human to human community where you can actually have conversations about it. So yeah, the idea of translation I find to be really, really interesting. But when it comes to fashion, it's interesting because we're looking at translating between these two worlds, like real life. Fashion is a tangible thing. You know, it's like we wear it, we have to wear it, it's a part of our survival. And then when we're putting it online, then what is fashion then? What is it? Like, we're no longer, like, we dress avatars because we do it in our real world, and we're simulating, you know, our lived realities, but it's still not reality. We can do so much in Second Life, or even like in 3D, like you said, like scanning these garments, it really allows us to look at every single pixel of these items that we're creating, but then we have the power to manipulate it in any way we want. And with the exhibition, it's interesting to talk about things that are just floating in space, or talk about having an avatar dressed in Leanna's garment, and Leanna wants her jingle pants to be able to be switched so that someone can have their avatar wear that. In real life, that would never happen. You could never go to an art gallery and see a garment and put it on. But then I think on the flip side, when it comes to fashion, there's the one side where in a gallery you can't interact with the arts, and especially textiles, because they're fragile, like you said, Megan. But then in fashion, in terms of the commercial side of fashion, there's a sense of entitlement where people feel like they are allowed to have anything. If they can pay for it, then they can have it and they can own it, which I think, especially in Indigenous fashion and a lot of cultural based fashion, is a huge issue, because we can't just take it. People have taken time to know how to create that fashion. Like Megan, when you create your pieces, those are stories that have, like, they hold stories and clans and symbols that have been passed on to you, and they're very meant for very specific times or people, and as gifts, or however that work is shared. So when I think about transmediation, it opens up a whole new world of carrying on where we come from and carrying on stories and that knowledge that I think is so, so important. But it slightly frightens me because like, how are people going to use it? I feel like, these kinds of platforms, especially open source platforms like Second Life, anyone can access it, and anything can happen in there. Even though it's not real life, we're still in this matrix that is kind of real life. So yeah, I think when I think about transmediation related to fashion specifically, I'm both very excited for it, and I'm really so excited and curious about the exploration that we are starting to do in Second Life, and how we can move that beyond just that screen. Like, how can we make it into AR? How can we, really, like, I want to see it all the time. I love the work that you guys create. Like, I love it so much. And so how do we share that in a way that I think is respectful and is within, what the artist intends for it to be experienced. Yeah, that's what I think about it in terms of fashion. Thanks for asking me that, Lisa.
You're welcome. That's good.
So Megan, I thought it was really interesting that you were just talking about the wireframes, or not the wireframes, but like how you actually 3D, I guess, printed or copied, or your actual woven capes, or textiles, and but that it sounds to be like a very different process than what we're doing in Second Life. What do you think about these processes? Like,
I think my impression is that it's like in Second Life, you can actually build within Second Life, whereas here it was like done by a person and then re-uploaded into like a version that could be shared. So I guess it wasn't open sourced programs, I'm guessing, because there was some protections that we had when we were creating that piece. The group I was working with, they were really concerned with, like, you don't want this in an open source thing because people can just take it and like print some keychains, it can be very easily stolen, which I guess is like what you're talking about. It can be for either copyright or intellectual property, cultural property can be really like dangerous in a way. And I think Sko and Adi was saying that they have it so people can't alter things in that space, like you need permissions from them. But yeah, I wanted to say too, though, like when you're talking about translation, it's so interesting. I'm still thinking about that concept as well, and just how if you think about translation, like so much can get lost, like you said, but also there's never a direct translation. Like things are altered in a way that can't be really undone. And it's really interesting to think about that, about how the work is transformed by being in the spaces that we're bringing it into, and kind of somewhat of there's somewhat of like a dissonance between traditional practices like beadwork and weaving and different things, that when you bring it into this other, they're almost like two different creations of two different worldviews, I guess, that placing them together just creates this kind of like friction to me in a way that's really interesting, that I don't really understand, but that I like to think about. But
Well, I think, you know, what's really, what you're making me remember is, or just from the other day when we met down in Second Life, was that even the physical parameters that we work within, you know, like the physics of gravity that we work within, you know, the sort of material, parameters that we work within in our physical world compared to virtual, like even just thinking about suddenly that art, that, you know, that beaded shawl of Olivia's could suddenly become a super huge in a virtual space, could, you know, be the scale of it could change so easily, the size and scale of it could change so easily, and like we could suddenly make something float in the air, or we could, you know, I guess I'm thinking maybe not, I guess I'm not picking up on your thread of like this idea of world view or the way that worlds are, but I guess I'm thinking more in the physical manifestation of it, like how, or the non-physical, the virtual, like what the possibilities are and how that opens up different possibilities. It's almost like a dream world. It's like almost the world that we can create, you know, conjure up in our imaginations, or how we imagine, how we can imagine something, because in your imagination, I mean, you can go a little further than what you could do in a physical space, right? And so even just sort of bringing yourself into the Second Life and thinking about, trying not to think about the parameters, the physics of a physical space is a challenge to just go like, oh wait, we could just make that thing floating there, or suddenly that thing could have like, I don't know, lightning bolts coming out of every point or whatever. Like there is something interesting about that, entering that imaginary space. I guess I would say more imaginary than dream, because we have this consciousness. Anyway, that's, I don't know if that, but what you're talking about makes me think of those potentials, and like how it is actually challenging to just start understanding the possibilities in that realm.
yeah, when we did that first walkthrough, that's what I was considering too. Like this could be a really amazing way to like prototype things for the real world, to build spaces, to explore different ideas. And yeah, sometimes there's like a group, I think they're called Drift Studios somewhere in Europe, but they do these installations and different art installations and stuff that to me feel like what you could do, like the things that I would wish I could do but don't have the resources to do. And yeah, I see what you're saying though. I think I really agree with that, and it's really liberating in a way.
Yeah, but do you think maybe could you explain a little more about what you were thinking about the different kinds of world views? Maybe I'm curious to know more what you mean about that.
I guess it's I guess if you like strip both practices, I don't know what you would call like the creation of technology is such a collaborative thing, from what I've learned from talking with Conrad, who's like got a really interesting perspective on like the way he thinks about what he does and about technology itself is really interesting. I can't really explain it that well, but basically just the origins of technology and where that comes from, and the way, basically the scientific worldview. I think it's a product of that. And I mean, beadwork or weaving, like what is that a product of? And those are very different worldviews. I think it's that a guy, Leroy Littlebear, I think his name is, and he does a talk about this, about how the quantum worldview is much more in line with, like, for him, his Blackfoot worldview, and that the Western scientific worldview we're like still living in that as a society. It's been, science has like far surpassed that, and it's got to this other place that's like really quite mystical, but our lives aren't functioning in that way. But he was talking about how the Blackfoot worldview was much more based in what we call the quantum worldview now. And I don't know, I think, yeah, just like the origins of the practices, I think, where they come from and how they're now enmeshing. Sorry to talk about weaving all the time, but
I think that's fine. That's what you're all about. Go for it.
Yeah. One thing that that we kind of discovered along the way was that it was actually like that the Jacquard loom was actually the first version of like computer programming, and like considered the origin of like the computer, I guess, which is really neat that like weaving specifically has ties to the development of computers as technology and programming, and like to bring those things back together, like they're meeting again in this like crazy way. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that I think there's also some other places where people have brought in, relating, like I believe it's Buffy St. Marie who wrote about pixels in relation to beadwork, and so the digital and the fiber kind of work relating. So I think that I didn't realize that Jacquard and again the Jacquard weaving and computer being, that connection there. That's really fascinating to me, actually.
Yeah, it's I can't remember who invented it now, but it was, yeah, super old technology. What was I going to say about that though? Sorry, I lost my train of thought completely.
That's okay. Sorry if I threw you off.
No, it was, oh yeah, that was what it was. It was, I think it's binary, like the
Binary code.
Binary
Yeah.
is like the way that the designs, probably in beadwork, and then Raven's tail weaving in particular, has like a binary code that, but essentially that's like what it is.
Embedded in it. And there's, so that's the art. I was trying to look for this article, and it's really bugging me that I can't find it, that really looked at kind of digital, like indigenous new media and new media works and bead, like wampum and things like this. And I wish I could find it off the top of my head, but not off the top of my head, but on my computer that I'm staring at. But there has been quite a bit of text that kind of connects those things, and I think it's really important. And I think there are artists like Cheryl Larondel who are also have lots to say about that, and I think that these conversations could start, expanding and building, or we could join those conversations too at some point. Or maybe we already have in our transmediation.
I think we already have.
Yeah, we already have.
Yeah.
So sometimes you don't know where you are because you're already in the middle of it, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, especially when we're like, COVID has kind of forced us into this place of exploration.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we would have, well, Megan, you were already exploring that. But like on this large scale of fashion and craft, I feel like people are being forced to really think about their work in different ways and how to create it, like what that means. And like, like I think when we're actually making in physical form, there's a lot of honoring that goes into our work, and acknowledging where stuff comes from. And like, a lot of us have really strong ideas around that work, and now we're putting it online. And sometimes, like, I think sometimes it talks about like trade, some of our work, and it really carries on a lot of old ways of trade, of storytelling, and how we pass that knowledge from generation to generation. And now that we're like changing into this world of, being forced to change into this world, I feel like it's happening really quickly, but it feels like it's something that we have to do almost, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to get to enjoy this work together. We wouldn't be able to share these stories together. Yeah, so I think that we're in it, but we're kind of being forced into it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But not to go on and on, but I think that we also, in terms of like this moment, yeah, but thankfully there's already been artists that have been doing, online, work online, like Skawanati, like artists that have been doing net art, this is not, that there is a pathway there, right? Net art and web-based kind of work that, since, the 90s, and so there's that really nice, like that there is this kind of pathway for what we feel an urgency, or, a kind of what we need, sort of the conditions that we're working under right now. So I get that. I think that's kind of part of what we've entered into, like it's brought us into that which they've already worked on for so many years.
Yeah. It's still quite new, I find. That's like just the newness of it. I find it to be like, and there's so many people who have paved the way, like Buffy. When I think about Buffy and like the work that she's created with, in early days, I think of Photoshop and how the work looks at the time. It was very pixelated, and I feel like that's kind of what we're working with right now in Second Life, is just how pixelated that work is, and what the limitations are in actually building the work. I find very interesting because it's like aesthetically, the work ends up like it suggests what the work is. We can see, what, it's a garment, but it doesn't carry, the small details of a bead, unless you built every single bead in the space, which would be a literal sphere, and then you can add a color to it. But then it becomes something that actually takes possibly just as much time to recreate in a digital form as it does in real life. But then you can duplicate it, I guess, like just like create multiple once you've created that framework on the internet. So I feel like there's just a whole bunch of exploration when I'm looking, especially at the exhibition, and the way that each of the artists are approaching it. I'm just thinking about the process and the way that it's being built, and what does that mean? I feel like there are so many conversations to have around, copyrights, like we were talking about, and but also it opens up the possibility of having it show in galleries around the world, because you're no longer having to ship the like very fragile textiles around the world, and potentially be damaged or be lost, and right. So I find it to be it's a very exciting world, and to see the designers actually jump in and building it, and how they go about that, I think is going to be quite interesting. Like, Megan, when you saw them building, it was your piece, or was it Olivia's, when they used a long tube to start creating the threads, and in that moment they were saying that we can create these tubes, but they can't get too small because then you can't see them anymore. But then in that moment, because we blew up the textile to be like the size of a movie screen within that space, the thin thread then looked like a very thin thread, right? Like so what, I just find it so interesting.
It's super interesting. I feel like it could like continue this conversation for like 3 hours easily. Yeah. So many different, because we've been talking about objects and like kind of art-ish type talk, but like fashion is so, like fashion and art are these two, they can be like merging and one at the same and like brushing up against each other. And then like the cultural aspect of Indigenous fashion and fashion, what it is and how free it is in a way. I mean, I was reading about why like a lot of fashion designers can just easily get ripped off. Like like the big fashion houses just get ripped off every season from the fast fashion places, and they do it cheaper, but they copy the designs and the styles all the time. And this one article was saying how that's how trends start, and that's how change and transformation is like pushed super hard in that area. But like our bringing our cultural aspects of it into the world, I mean, it has its own kind of way it's running in the world that's super unhealthy. I think a lot of people would agree, and really detached, even though it's something that's so intimate to our lives and our survival, like you said, that it there's this like distance from it and lack of understanding around where it comes from. And I think a lot of that, as I reflect on it, has to do with how early on textiles were industrialized, because I think they were regarded as quite sacred by almost everywhere in the world. And if not sacred, then at least valued, because people understood the work that went into creating it, and like had this concept of repair and keeping and caring for things that you really needed. But one thing I think would be really interesting, I mean, just as you take like all these different pieces or ideas of like what fashion is, what technology is, and like what art is, what indigenous art and fashion is, and the way that some of them clash with each other and conflict, like the whole idea of open source versus how we think about our designs, you know, is very, very different. But I mean, in a way, I think it would be incredibly cool, like if, like, say, as like clothing designers or like beadwork or weaving designs, and like, in a way, I get like really violently angry about the idea of it. But on the other hand, I think how amazing it would be if there were like, say, you had like the exhibit, and then there were patterns that came, like you could take the pattern and create that work within your own space if you wanted to, or like just to physicalize it, like the physicality to be like go from here existing into this like Second Life platform and recreated there, and then there to be a template to then it to come back into the world and the space of the person there, and the making of, and how powerful that is. But then there's just so many problems with that as an idea. But as a general idea, I think it would be really neat. I think some musicians have done that, where they just created like sheet music. I think Beck did that a long time ago, where he was like, this is my album. Like, if you want to hear it, you got to play it, kind of thing.
That's amazing.
Which is quite cool. But yeah, that's kind of like an interesting like thought, because that's really like an extension of like the idea of an open source thing, and connecting people with like the making of.
Yeah, and the spirit of it is sharing, but the spirit of it is sharing, but then it's vulnerable to the market, right? Like I guess it comes to it's vulnerable to being like taken up and commodified. I guess that's where the risk is, right? Do you think?
Yeah,
totally. It's so interesting. Like when you speak about industrialization, like it was industrialized specifically for capitalists. Like that's the reason why the industry, like you had aristocrats in Western Europe who were like, they wanted to create quick change, and that's what fashion was like this idea of things that quickly change, and you saw only the most elite having certain garments, and then eventually it would trickle down so lower class people could own it, and then a new style would come out, and that system was built specifically to create money for those people at the top. And so when I think about industrialization, like that's what it's for. I think like it's meant to make money. And that's why we get into all these issues of like exploitation of our designs, where, you know, as a community, of course it makes sense to share the pattern, because we should all be able to have a nice jacket. And like we should technically all know or have someone in our family who could recreate that jacket for us. But then you see someone who is just wanting to make money. They don't care about the design. They don't care about its functions. All they know is that it's going to make money. And then that's why we can't put our, you know, these beautiful pieces that, you know, if you want to have it, if you want to wear it, you have to make it. Like, I love that idea. I love that concept. But it's just, we live in this world where ultimately it would be, used in really awful ways.
Yeah.
Well, to me, it brings it back to this question, interesting, like a question that interests me about Indigenous fashion is because we see, fashion, well, this is the world, fashion according to Lisa Myers, who knows nothing much about fashion anyway, but like fashion has a kind there, to me, it seems like fashion trends, and I wouldn't say trends, but like fashion, say collections, are influenced, there's a kind of a visual culture that influences it. And like, there's different kinds of inspiration for them. But I feel like Indigenous fashion works in a different realm, in a sense that if like I think there is a kind of different realm that it's working within, rather than being very that holds to the kind of integrity of a design that is passed down. Like, there's a kind of, there isn't, I guess I'm trying to think about like, how does Indigenous fashion relate to, say, lack of better term, mainstream fashion, or how does it, how there isn't the conversation, there's a conversation that's a little less fluid and easy because of the integrity of designs and things that are connected to really important, whether it be clans or crests or like whatever, so do you know what I mean, this question of like, how can it be influential and mainstream, but it's not important that it is, or something, like that's kind of the question that comes up for me. I don't know, you probably had to deal with that question a bunch of times, Sage, or you too, Megan, and like, so I don't know if I'm if I'm digging up stuff that's already been sort of reconciled, but I think about it sometimes.
I think it's so interesting, especially in the context of an art exhibit. Like, that's why I just think it's so important to kind of align this idea of fashion in commerce, but fashion in art, because I find like our community is definitely more circular and holistic in the way that we approach how we create, how we share, in I love the idea that you are wealthy based on how much you can give, right? That's what wealth is based on with a lot of our cultures and our Indigenous nations. It's not based on how much you have. And fashion is purely based on the idea of, how much money can you make from the clothing that people are creating. Whereas, like I said, our communities I just find are just so much more circular in terms of supporting each other and making sure that that visual language or the material culture around it is for all of us. Yeah.
It's a really tough one, I think.
It is.
On the one hand, it is all of the things that you just said in such a profound way. But it is, on the other hand, too, people are making things that are for sale to anyone at the same time. So there is, in a sense, it is going out into the world, and but then there's just the question of who profits from it. But then I wonder, on the end result, what is that end result, and is it where is it going, I guess. But
that's such a good question. We're just at our we're just at our last few minutes, so I just kind of want to. We could definitely talk about this forever, and just be like, oh yeah, that's true, and we have there's just so much knowledge, and like in this, like the study and the research, the act of actually doing things, like looking at fashion through an art exhibit, and then looking at it through online exhibition, and then also we have retail commerce, and like there's just so much. But if there's any last words, I would love to hear what both of you have to say.
Well, I think the work that Indigenous, what I've learned a lot, you know, from working with you, Sage, is like Indigenous Fashion Week does assert, you know, it really asserts the practices of Indigenous designers. And I think that there's like a real strength in that, because it starts these conversations. It starts, you know, discussions around all the issues that came up today in this conversation. And I think it's something that's just, you know, realize that it relates to, even if I don't consider I've, you know, have anything to do with the fashion world, I feel like that I can have a conversation that relates to ideas that I'm interested in when I work with artists that are, you know, working with, you know, fiber-based or textile-based kind of work. So, you know, I think that's really important. I think that these ideas of translation and transmediation are things that we're dealing with all the time. But I really appreciated being able to talk to you both about those ideas too, and how Megan, especially like how your work between you know, from the physical to the digital has been, how that's been for you, and the ideas of translation that come up. So this has been really interesting. I don't know if you have any last words there too, Megan.
No, just to say, well, I don't know, to say thank you. This has been a really interesting conversation, and yeah, I appreciate all the work you both are doing so much. It's a real honor to have the conversation. I don't know what else, but yeah.
No, thank you so much. I'm just, yeah, I am so thrilled about, you know, like being able to speak about it, because as we're working through the actual exhibition, these conversations are so important. I feel like we are speaking about something that we are right in the middle of trying to understand. And it's exciting and scary, and to jump in. And I'm so grateful that I get to do that with you guys. And you guys fill me with a lot of knowledge and things to think about. And I'm so glad that we got to share that together today. Thank you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.